This may seem like a strange conversation to be having the day before the NFL draft, as everyone else in America that covers the NFL is obsessing over where some of these players are going to go. But this is the day that we could slot this in. And it's a discussion I really wanted to have because as the draft has gotten closer and more people have wrestled with the idea of Jeremiyah Love going in the top 5. I think that there have been a bunch of discussions about when this is okay, where we are at with running back value. And we've been having this conversation, Barnwell, on the show for like a month. And I've felt myself just kind of going back to some old tropes as I've had this discussion and weighed it. And so I kind of want to just take a step back and evaluate and interrogate even some of the arguments I've been putting forth as part of this discussion and really just kind of reset where we're at with all of the arguments on both sides of this issue as we prepare for Jeremiyah Love to probably be a top 5 pick in this draft.
I have to warn people because this can be the worst discussion.
Yes.
On the internet.
Yes.
We are going to try hard to make that not be the case. There's very few people on the planet I want to have this conversation with. You, Mays, are one of them. So I just want to say, I'm warning you. I'm anti-warning you now. We are going to try and make this fun.
Yeah, and that's I think it's, you never want to be like, this is going to be a different version of that discussion, but I kind of want it to be because, and the reason that I am comfortable saying that is because I don't feel strongly enough about one side or the other to be annoying about this. I think that's my hope in terms of where we land at the end of this discussion. Like, I'm ready to be swayed, I guess is what I would say.
We don't have to, we could be smart enough here to not have a binary conversation about either running backs are completely useless and you can literally just plug in any jabroni and you're going to be fine, or it's 1973 and the first 4 MVP picks should all be running backs. There's a middle ground there. There's nuance there we can get to, we can have a conversation about, and this conversation is different right now than it would have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 or 40 years ago for lots of reasons that I'm sure we're going to get to today.
And that's partially why I wanted to do this, because I think that a lot of my kind of quick responses and the quick talking points that I go to about this are probably a little bit too weighted to the conversation that we were having 7 to 10 years ago. And if you look at it, that's when a lot of the running backs don't matter stuff started to creep up. And it makes sense based on what the league looked like at that time. You know, like I think about like the 2018 Chiefs. Right. And just like that offense and just how monumental and transformative that period in the NFL felt like. And the idea that you could have that offense and just kind of throw Kareem Hunt in there and it didn't really matter and they could be one of the best offenses we've ever seen. It felt like that was a consistent thing around the NFL in like that era. And I do think the league has changed enough where it's probably worth revisiting a lot of the things we used to say about this topic. And that's why, along with me kind of questioning the validity of the other things that I was saying and a lot of the things that I was saying, thought this might be a good time to actually have this version of the conversation.
I think it goes back further. And it's not like you realize this in a moment, but just, to me, this is a Shanahan offense conversation, right?
Yes.
This is going back to Terrell Davis.
Yeah, there are different periods of it, right? Like there are different versions of why it happens, and they kind of build on top of each other.
But that to me is the combo of, we saw not just one back, like they just stumbled on Terrell Davis in the late rounds of that draft, but it was
Olandis Gary,
Arian Foster, Olandis Gary, Mike Anderson in Denver. And you saw Kyle Shanahan go around the league and his offenses sort of spread around the league, and Alfred Morris thrived in Washington. You saw over and over again these late round picks thriving at running back. And so because that offense became the meta and because that offense was so successful, I'd even throw CJ Anderson coming off of his couch and replacing Todd Gurley and looking great in there as well. I think that was the biggest long-term trend. I think if it had just been a team or maybe just like a guy here or there, I think it would have been like, hey, they just landed a stud in the 6th round. That happens. That's not crazy to imagine. They just landed a really good running back. And not to say those backs I mentioned aren't good, because they are good, but there's so many elements to that Shanahan offense and the meta of that Shanahan offense, and how not only has the meta of the NFL changed, but also the meta of that offense itself has changed and how it's spread around the NFL. And I think that changes the way that the role that those running backs have in those offenses and how valuable the running backs could be within the context of those offenses.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I do think that it's funny that a lot of the arguments that we're going to talk about maybe are a little bit more recent. Like the data points that we go to are a little bit more recent. But when you think about the true baseline examples of why you can find running backs late, you go back like 25 years immediately to think about those Shanahan teams. The fact that that's the first place we go, even though there's a lot more recent stuff that's more relevant to this discussion, I think is pretty telling.
Of course. But I mean, you can go back to last year's draft, though, no? I mean, and this is not, to me, I don't put this on Ashton Jeanty, but the conversation we were having a year ago was, can you take him in the top 10 if you're not a great team, like the Raiders were not, and they were heavily favored to take him and then took him, but in a draft where there were so many backs we felt good about later in the first round, into day 2, even into day 3 of that draft, is taking your running back in the top 10 valuable? And it's different this year because with Jeremiyah Love is a phenomenal running back prospect, and I think the most likely scenario is that he is a great player in the NFL, and I hope he ends up in a place where he can do that. But there is more of a drop-off this year. It's not as deep of a running back class. It's not as explosive or exciting of a running back class maybe as it was last year. And so I think that this changed the calculus in evaluating Love. I know we're going to have a broader conversation, but I think Love is a unique player, given that this is a draft where not just at running back, but at so many other positions, so many other spots in the top 10, or even into the top 20, we're looking at players who don't have that classic fit for a critical position. We're looking at guys who maybe don't profile as X receivers going in the top 20. We're looking at guys who, are hybrid linebacker edge rushers going in the top 10, safeties potentially being top 15 picks. Like, this is a weird draft. And so I think that lends itself to Jeremiyah Love being a more interesting player to discuss at the very top of the draft than he would be in a draft where there were more, wide receivers and left tackles and edge rushers available in the top 10.
I totally agree with that. I think we can get into that. Just the idea of, there's a couple different places that we can hit that. The idea of how safe a Jeremiyah Love is compared to some of the other prospects and when that becomes okay. Let's start. So what I want to do with this is I kind of want to take a lot of the canned arguments and points that come up in this discussion and just interrogate them. Be like, we say this. Is this true? And then just kind of keep going through them as we do it. Okay. And so you talking about being able to get running backs later in last year's draft, and then just again, it's a refrain we go back to very often. This idea of there are running backs, you can find running backs later, so that's why you shouldn't take one in the top 10. This is my first, is this true? Like, is this actually true in the way that we find the players at the position in the modern NFL over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Let's look at this. So as you think about this idea of you shouldn't draft a running back in the top 10 because in most years, let's say that, just as a qualifier, in most years and over time, you're able to find them in more places than the first round of the NFL draft. Do you think right now that is a valid argument against drafting a running back high?
Maybe, but for not for the reasons that I think, not for the reasons I think you're putting out there. I think the answer is probably
it's not
yes,
for the Arian Foster reasons. It's not for those reasons.
No, it's not. And I think, number one, the league is adjusted, right? I mean, we've seen fewer running backs go in the first round over the last 15 or 20 years. And so I think the value of, you can't put running backs in a vacuum, but like the idea that 20 years ago, we would not be having a conversation about Jeremiyah Love being a top 5 pick. It would be a no doubt obvious that that's where he's going to go. If you have a running back who's number 1 on a lot of big boards, which I think Jeremiyah Love is close on a lot of big boards, there would be no conversation to have here. So that has changed. We're seeing, I think, guys who would go in the bottom of round 1 go in the middle of round 2. We're seeing guys who would go in the middle of round 2 get to round 3. I think we're seeing running backs drop already. And so some of that has already been priced in. I would argue the opportunity cost is the bigger factor. That idea of you're taking a running back in the first round. It's not, he's probably going to stink. He's going to be bad. We can get to the success rate for those picks in a minute, but it's that conversation of, you're drafting a guy at the position the NFL values at a lower level than just about anything besides kicker, punter, long snapper, and fullback, which is where running back is right now after the Tyler Linderbaum contract. Centers, have jumped up over running backs when it comes to second contract value and 3-year contract value for those positions. So there's that. But I think the bigger thing that's changed, and this to me is really significant, is there's more free agent backs available and good free agent backs available. And that, I think, is where the league has changed. And it's, again, you can't quantify this, but I would just look at the free agent classes over the last 15 years. How many times has a Saquon Barkley caliber prospect at a different position, sorry, a Saquon Barkley caliber player in the prime of his career hit the market at a different position? It's pretty rare. Even a Derrick Henry, who signed for, I mean, $7 million a year, $7.5 million a year with the Ravens. Like, not that Derrick Henry didn't have some red flags, because he did in terms of his workload, but like a Derrick Henry caliber player hitting the market. Like, it happens, but it's just so rare. And I would even go to this year, Mays, with Kenneth Walker, like a guy who certainly not perfect, but prime of his career, coming off of a Super Bowl, wasn't going to make a ton of money, got the $13 million a year or so. How often are those guys hitting the market at any other position in football? There's that opportunity to get guys that I think makes it less painful maybe to skip on guys in the draft.
There's a bunch of different things happening here, and I think you hit on most of them. So this idea that, well, you can find running backs deep into day 3 even, and that's why it's hard to justify drafting a running back high. If you look at the numbers even over the last 2 decades, that doesn't really bear out. Like, most of the impact running backs that are drafted in the NFL, if you just look at the percentages, are actually coming in the first 2 rounds of the draft. It's mostly from rounds 1 and 2, and there's a good chunk of them coming from round 1 specifically. And I think that's even more obvious and even clearer when you look at the last like 5-ish years. Right now, drafting a running back in the top half of the first round, for the most part, those guys have worked out. Like, those have been good picks in terms of, like, those are good NFL players. We're happy that they're on our team over the last 10 or so years.
They are, but we're going to get to this with the Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs discussion, I think. That idea of, like, when you hit, what do you get with a running back versus other positions? That, I think, is also the complicating factor here.
Sure. And we'll talk about the surplus value and all of those things, and that's also part of this discussion. But the wasteland is actually in the back half of the first round. The back half of the first round is where we've had a lot of misses, and we just haven't had a lot of impact players come from that range in general. I'm going to read off to you the names of the running backs taken in the back half of the first round since 2006, so the last 20 years, okay? And we won't include Omarion Hampton because that just happened. Lawrence Maroney, Felix Jones, Rashard Mendenhall, Najee Harris, Josh Jacobs, Travis Etienne, Rashad Penny, Donald Brown, D'Angelo Williams, Mark Ingram, Javid Best, Joseph Asai, Beanie Wells, Sony Michel, Doug Martin, David Wilson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So that's actually the treacherous stretch.
I just saw like a decade of my life flashing past my eyes.
The first half of the first round, we're talking about guys like Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Adrian Peterson, Bijan Robinson, Christian McCaffrey, Todd Gurley, Jahmyr Gibbs. So the first half of the first round has actually been a good place to find these guys. The league typically is good at identifying those sorts of players. The difference, and it's not that you can find these guys deep into day 3, but the fact that there's also pretty much an equal number of impact backs found in round 2, that is the slight difference between this and other like premium positions. Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry, James Cook, Kenneth Walker, Maurice Jones-Drew, LaShawn McCoy, Matt Forte, Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb. There are a lot of impact backs over the last 20 years that come from round 2. The position where it's almost all round 1, there's 2 of them. Offensive tackles, your impact guys are coming from the first round. Like, almost invariably, they're coming from the first round. Edges is also heavily weighted. If you look since 2006, the edge rushers that have made multiple Pro Bowls, there have been 39 of them. 26 of them were drafted in round 1. 26 of the 39. Again, with offensive tackles, it's almost all of them. The position where there's actually a wide distribution in the draft, and that it was actually interesting looking at this, is actually wide receiver. The impact receivers you find across the entire draft. And so I think that's why, I mean, you think about the 2 recent examples. Amon-Ra, St. Brown, and Puka are 2 examples of like all pro caliber players we just found on day 3. But you need 2 to 3 receivers per team. So that also weighs it differently. And the other side of this is exactly what you said about free agency. wide receivers, Jason Fitzgerald just wrote about this on Over the Cap last week, where he was looking at the percentage of the top 20 players at the position and what percentage of them come from free agency specifically. Wide receiver is 9.5%. All the other premium positions are 30% or lower when you're looking at the top 20 players. Running backs is up near like 50%. It's in the same range as safeties, linebackers, tight ends, a lot of these other positions where you can find guys in free agency. So the scarcity argument isn't as much about being able to find guys into day 3 as we might have made it out to be a decade ago. But there still is much less scarcity at running back than there is at some of these other premium positions, even if most of the best players often come from the first half of the first round.
Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, what's happened with running backs is that they're getting paid less than they were adjusting for cap a decade ago, or especially 20 years ago. And that seems wrong to me. It does seem like now second contracts for running backs are underpaid. Like I just look back at last year, James Cook he wasn't a free agent. He got an extension with the Bills, but it was the final year of his deal. He got $11.5 million a year. And I feel bad because I pick on these dudes every time I talk about 2025 contracts. De'Ami Brown and Tutu Atwell got $10 million a year. James Cook is a better player. He fumbles too much. He has some flaws here or there. James Cook is better for your offense than De'Ami Brown and Tutu Atwell, and he should not be making $1.5 million more.
So isn't that actually an argument that paying a running back is a way to find value, right? If you find a really good running back, and so this idea,
not even a really good running back, but just that idea of it's less painful to pay a back and take a shot on a back versus taking a shot on a player at another position.
So this plays into the surplus value argument to me, which we can get to that right now if you want to, right? So this idea of, and I go to this all the time. I'm very guilty of this. I've said this a bunch, even in the lead up to this draft cycle, where let's look at the highest paid players at running back and let's look at the highest paid players at other positions, right? If you draft Jeremiyah Love at 3 overall, he immediately becomes the 7th highest paid running back in the NFL. If you draft a wide receiver at that spot, it's the 40th highest paid player at the position. When you get to second contracts, you're paying a 2x premium for a running back compared to an offensive tackle, a 3x premium for a running back compared to an edge rusher or a wide receiver. That surplus value is important when you think about the context of team building and where you can spend your resources in a capped league. But as you think more about it, I think there are layers and nuances to this. The first one is, are we at a place, and I asked a lot of people about this last week, GMs, people in analytics departments, because I was like, all right, let's poke and prod a lot of this stuff. Are we at a place where with the cap inflating the way that it does, and teams being so good at manipulating the salary cap, where surplus value actually matters less now when it comes to team building than it ever has in the NFL, and shouldn't necessarily be the driving force of how you make these decisions?
It matters less. And I think you can fit more things onto your roster if you truly want to. Before I get to that, I want to just contextualize for people how running back contracts have changed. So for percentages of the cap, this year, Kenneth Walker signed an average, his deal is 4.7% of the cap in 2026. Travis Etienne's 3.9%. Those are like solid starters, right? Like they're not they're players where it's like, okay, you feel pretty good about them. I have questions about their, like, are they going to be 1,300-yard rushers? I'm not sure, but they could be useful players. That's what Lamar Miller and Chris Ivory were getting a decade ago. That's a little, I think. Those guys are not as good as those players who just signed in free agency. Go back 2 decades ago. Edgerrin James signs with the Cardinals. Now, you remember Edgerrin James' tenure with the Cardinals. He got 7.5% of the cap. He almost got twice as much as Kenneth Walker or Travis Etienne. Jamal Lewis re-upped with the Ravens on a 3-year deal. He got 8.2% of the cap. And the following year, Amon Green signed with the Texans as a 30-year-old for 5.3% of the cap. That's my point, is it's not just that does surplus value mean less because the cap is going up, but it's just the actual price you have to pay to get these guys in the building or keep them around is so much less than it was 20 years ago when we were forming these arguments about running back value. And so we would be having different conversations if those guys 20 years ago were signing for half of what they were making then. And we'd be having different conversations if Kenneth Walker was making $25 million a year, which is what he would be making if he was making about 7.5% of this year's salary cap. And so I feel like that conversation is not caught up with where the cap has gone. And that matters a lot. That does change, I think, some of the surplus value conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I also just think, again, like, ultimately, if in a salary capped league, you're always going to have to make concessions. You're always going to have to decide this or that. I mean, let's go to the Eagles 2 years, like last offseason, right? Like the Eagles could not pay Milton Williams. The Eagles could not pay Jalen Phillips. Even the teams that are the most aggressive in how they're manipulating this stuff still are going to have to lose out on players because it is a capped league and you ultimately have to make choices. I just think that right now, those choices are less frequent than they've ever been, especially with teams that are willing to manipulate this thing. And I think we've drifted to a place where I think you can make a really serious argument that the absolute value of the talent on your team is more important than where and how often you're finding surplus value as you're building your team. And I think that the potential chance that Jeremiyah Love is going to be a good player compared to some of these other guys at other positions in this draft, especially when you look at the hit rate on these top 10, top 12-ish picks recently, you can make a serious argument that the more absolute value you're going to be getting from these picks is from Jeremiyah Love versus a lot of the other guys that you could draft in that spot, even if the surplus value argument is not in your favor.
But then there's the thing of you can't get a Saquon Barkley caliber edge rusher in free agency. You can get a Saquon Barkley in free agency. So looking at the broader running back pool, and I did this 3 years ago when I was writing about Bijan before that draft. So this is not updated between now and then. Obviously, Bijan's going to, I think, has had his option picked up, if I'm not mistaken. Or they've announced
that's also part of this, by the way. Bijan's option's $11 million.
Helps.
Nice. Zay Flowers' option is $27 million. Like, that should play into this.
It does. That's true. So Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs are going to have their options picked up, obviously. So these numbers are going to help. But when I looked a few years ago, did the math for this was for the bottom half of round one. I think it was the Cowboys pick that year. They've been a playoff team. So just the idea of given that running back contracts are less than any other position, other second contracts, given that the draft is a flat cap where you're just basically, no matter what position you pick, whether you pick a quarterback or a long snapper, you're paying them the exact same amount for the first 4 years of their deal. You can use that to kind of figure out, okay, how right do I have to be about a running back at that spot versus a player at another position? With running backs, they have to pan out 63% of the time for that late first round pick on a running back to work. For a wide receiver, has to be 26% of the time. Edge rusher, same thing, 26% of the time. So you just have to be significantly more certain. And I think that's the problem to me is I don't know if we can be that certain. I would love to say we are really good at picking the running backs. And I think the guys you brought up in the first half of the draft are evidence that you can be the case. I'd also point out Leonard Fournette was in that discussion and did not do all that well. We're still waiting to see what happens with Ashton Jeanty. Even Saquon was obviously a great player for the Eagles. The Giants, Saquon, I think that's a hit. I don't really put it this way. He was a hit. He on the Giants was not a hit, unfortunately. But so those running backs had their fifth year option picked up 39% of the time. League average was, I think, right about 51%. So they were actually having their fifth year option picked up less often, even though it was going to be cheaper than other positions. That's going to change with Bijan and Gibbs getting into the mix. And we're not talking about a huge sample of running backs. I think it's 15 or 16 backs. So it's a pretty small group. But I think that's the concerning part to me is that if you could feel really confident you're going to get that guy, and maybe you only can in the first half of the first round, then okay, I think it's okay to do that. But I think when you just have this sort of uncertainty about everyone, and I think that's probably the most accurate position to take about NFL prospects, is just, we just don't know, and we are too confident with our ability to pick the right guy, you're better off taking those swings on edge rushers or wide receivers just because when you do hit, you're landing a guy worth $40 million a year in the current market, or $30 million a year in the current market. And you can never get that guy in the NFL at running back because that's just not running backs are worth necessarily.
I go to that all the time. And I usually, for the most part, I'm inclined to agree with you because I think that's right. I also think the back half of the first round we've seen it is a little bit different than the first half of the first round when it comes to players at this position. We're making like little caveats here to kind of like fit arguments. But in talking to people about this, I do think that the difference, if you're trying to paint one, between Leonard Fournette, even Ashton Jeanty, and some of the rest of these guys we're talking about, is the pass game value part of this is a necessary part for you to be drafting this guy in the first half of the first round. And I think that is generally become the conventional wisdom among smart people who are thinking about these decisions as well. And so Jeremiyah Love does check that box. I mean, if you look at it, and so you look at the receiving value part of this specifically, it's kind of an interesting like set of considerations because there used to be a lot of backs that were giving you a lot of receiving value even like 7-8 years ago, but they were specific kind of backs. Like they were the James Whites and the JD McKissicks and guys like that. When you look at these like do-it-all backs, Gibbs, Bijan, and CMC all had like at least 14 total EPA as receivers last year per next gen. That doesn't happen very often.
Okay, to be fair, they also all had negative rushing EPA. So I don't know if EPA is a good measure for
that's fair. Well, that's also part of the problem. I want to get into that as well. But like those guys, that doesn't happen that often. It has happened at times. Like the last set of players, I think that was kind of like this. There was a season where Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson did it. Like we have seen it previously. But if you're going to bet on these guys in the first half of the first round, you almost need them to be plus receivers for you. And Fournette and Ashton Jeanty just don't profile as those sorts of players. And I think that's why you can kind of question those picks compared to some of the others.
Okay. So you are right in that I think you need to be a good receiver to justify this. So I think it means a little less just because we are leaning more towards like the run game now. And I think that's maybe a reason we'll talk about that for maybe benefiting
we'll talk about that. Yeah.
One of my arguments that I think is total bullshit and is still total bullshit is the thing we hear about every single running back coming out in the top 10. Guys, you have to understand, he's not a running back. He's an offensive weapon. You can split him out wide. You can put him in the slot. You can make him a playmaker. Mays, I have a quote for you.
That is the part that's bullshit, though. The putting him out wide and in the slot thing is the part that's bullshit.
I have a quote for you. We're going to get to the numbers in a second. I have a quote for you about Breece Hall from Aaron Glenn before last season. You can do a lot with Breece, Glenn said. We're going to open up his game quite a bit. He's the type of guy you can split out wide and let him run the route tree because he can run it like a receiver.
It drives me crazy.
Do you want to know what Breece Hall did?
He can't do it as well as a receiver.
No. Not even that. Do you know how many routes Breece Hall ran out of the slot or split out wide last year?
Less than 10.
He ran 20. He turned them into 5 targets and 22 yards. That was 3 tunnel screens, a hitch against off coverage on 2nd and 14, and an option route for 5 yards on 1st and 10. It is the ultimate bullshit dump because no one actually goes back and checks to see whether these guys are actually being used this way. I went and looked. I went from 23 to 25. I looked at running backs on the whole. They average 0.36 yards per route run, split out wide, or split out wide or in the slot, which is basically like if Van Jefferson had a leg chopped off before the game and tried to run routes where you're at. Bijan was at 0.51 yards per route run, Gibbs 0.46. Alvin Kamara, who I think is a phenomenal receiving back, 0.51. Christian McCaffrey was at 0.99. The worst qualifying wide receiver over that stretch, split out wide or in the slot, was Jahan Dotson at 1.13 yards per route run. So basically, these superstar running backs who are, and I want to be clear, phenomenal receivers, actually valuable, impactful players as receivers. They're still running backs. They're not doing it in the slot. They're not doing it out wide. When they are, they're doing it on screens and gimmick stuff, which is okay. But like, let's just be honest about what they are and what they can do.
We'll say this one thing. I agree with you almost entirely. I think that's the one thing where every single time I hear it, I just start rolling my eyes. Those numbers, I think, are weighed down by what happens when you line a running back out wide in the situations you do it in.
No question.
Oh, so often you're lining that running back up at number one in order to get like some sort of man zone tell when you're in empty, things like this. Like it's a structural thing that you're doing. And so you're burning them on those plays, even if they're quote unquote running a route. So while I mostly agree with you,
but sometimes they're also motioning in a fair amount of the time too, after being spread out at number one.
All the time though, not if you stay out there,
but a fair amount of the time.
I do think those numbers are a little bit skewed just based on what happens when you're lining those guys up in those situations. But for the most part, yes, I do agree with you.
Okay, if you want to show me a 2-minute highlight reel of Bijan Robinson running the route tree, I'll happily say I'm wrong. You're not going to find it because he's not doing that. And Bijan Robinson, to be clear, rules. He is an awesome receiver. But I think there is that question about those players, right? Like this idea of the receiving back and this offensive weapon, even leaving that argument, which I find to ring very false, aside, there's the question of, are these guys winning because of their receiving skills, or are they winning because of what's being schemed up? And I pick on him a lot. He's a good player. I feel bad. This is like the Kyle Juszczyk argument to me, where it's like Kyle Juszczyk is not running some killer routes. Like he's getting open because Kyle Shanahan is scheming stuff open for him. That's not a Kyle Juszczyk thing. You plug in another pretty good fullback, you're going to get that. I think when you have backs who can run option routes, who can run choice stuff, who can, stretch teams horizontally, like, yes, that's a valuable thing, and you can find guys to do that, but that's not just a first round thing either. I mean, the Rams, every third down and fourth down, it felt like last year, they weren't going to Puka Nacua. It was the Kyron Williams option route, and Kyron Williams was not a first round pick. So I think we have to sort of delineate here between like how much of this is a running back creating in the structure of the offense versus how much of it is creating, or by running back creating after the catch, creating by making tackles, creating by actually separating from defensive backs, which I think is possible, but I just don't think is happening as often maybe as those arguments are making it out to be.
So this brings me into the next kind of argument against this that I want to dig into, and that's this idea of, okay, are running backs more dependent on the other elements of the offense to be impactful players for you? And is that one of the reasons that you should not be drafting them as high as the players that are actually creating that offensive infrastructure? Do we think that is true? Do we think that is a worthwhile argument against drafting a running back in the top 10 or higher?
It's the Ashton Jeanty argument, right? Like that's or the Saquon Barkley argument. That seems
that's exactly what you're saying about Saquon
to make it. And I mean, I guess what I would say is this, right? Like, you rarely run into teams that are as hopeless on offense around a running back as Ashton Jeanty and the Raiders last year. I mean, especially post Colton Miller injury, that offense was completely hopeless. With Ashton Jeanty on the field or not. I mean, what does seem fair to say is, I think about teams like the Cowboys in recent years, you can create a solid run game with a good offensive line and an underappreciated back. You can't do it with a great running back and a middling offensive line. But again, I think that's too simplistic and binary of an argument, because offensive lines are not either incredible or terrible. There's usually some middle grounds. Maybe it's okay, we have 2 offensive line we feel really good about, and 3 we don't feel great about, or we have 4 guys we feel good about, and 1 we don't feel great about. But I do think something that's missing, and I think this is a question of how teams are funding their offenses and funding their running games, is something that's missing from the conversation quite a bit. Like that conversation about a running back's not getting paid enough, are they underappreciated? It's fair and valid, but that money has mostly gone to interior offensive linemen. Like, NFL teams are still spending on their run games. They're just choosing to spend on centers and guards way more than they have in the past. And so when we think about, okay, should running backs get paid more? I would argue, yes, I think running backs, really good backs, should get paid more. Is that going to come from offensive linemen? Like which bucket does that come from in the team budget? And so I think if you're building an offense where you're investing that money in the run game and it happens to be on the offensive line, you can get results. I think if you're investing that in the running back and you're not investing as much in the offensive line, you can still get results, but you just have to hit your draft picks on the offensive line, which is tough. We're having a really good offensive line coach, which there's like 6 of them and a couple of them just retired. Like that to me is the tough part of, like, you can't just draft a running back and not have a good offensive infrastructure and succeed. Everyone knows that. But like, can you, or like you're having a choice about where are we investing? And I think you have to invest in both to make it really work.
So we've seen guard salaries really increase at a disproportionate rate compared to running backs. Centers have been more stagnant. That has now changed, right? I mean, and until this year, that has changed. So the argument about it, do you think there is a good argument for what? Because centers and guards specifically, right? The idea of where you can being able to find those players in free agency, those guys are available in free agency at about the same rate that running backs are available in free agency. So do you think that there is a reasonable argument as to why guards and centers should be paid more than running backs if we can find them at pretty much the same rates in the draft and we can find them at pretty much the same rate in free agency?
I would say they're on the field every snap. That to me is, I think, the tangible difference you can make is that
longevity maybe is the other one I would throw out there. Just like how long those guys can play. Argument
too. But I think also the idea of we don't have a lot of 3-down. Even the guys who we think of as 3-down backs, like Bijan Robinson can be a 3-down back, even though he was secretly really terrible in pass pro last year and nobody talks about it. But like a Christian McCaffrey's 3-down back, a Derrick Henry's a 3-down back. Those guys aren't playing 90% of the snaps most weeks. Like they are coming off the field a fair amount. And so you could take that as like a cynical NFL plot to reduce the value of the NFL running back. Maybe that's the case. I think teams have generally found like our offenses are better. Those lead backs are better when they get more breathers. They get more time off. They last longer. And I think to the idea of like, there was a run where a lot of second contracts for NFL backs went poorly. I think one of the reasons this most recent crop of second contracts have gone better is because guys are not getting as many carries, adjusted for the 17th game at least, on their rookie deals, as opposed to, I think about Todd Gurley and the workload he had, not just in terms of his carries and his receptions, but also just he was on the field 90% of the time, a fair amount of the time during that rookie deal under McVay.
Going back to the idea of our running backs more tied to the other elements of the offense and their ability to succeed, I do think that we have a decent amount of evidence that that is the case, right? Like, I think that Saquon to me is probably the best example. Like, when you go back and you look at those early Saquon seasons, Saquon as a rookie had a 32% rushing success rate. Like, those were slogs. Even if he was productive, those seasons were slogs.
He also, I think, led the league in rush yards over expectation that year.
Yes. And like he's doing everything he can.
Yeah.
And it's still negative. I'll say this though, because I still land in a place where I think it is harder for a running back to transcend his circumstances than it is for a lot of other positions. I just do. I think it's just harder to do. And I think that is an argument in favor of going some of these other directions instead of a running back. I also think that the aesthetics of this play into it, right? Like a running back, even in a moderate workload, Ashton Jeanty is going to touch the ball 250 times. We are going to watch Ashton Jeanty run into the back of his lineman 250 times. Even for wide receivers in bad situations, it's just not as ugly to watch. And so I think it lasts a little bit less. Like we don't quite have it burned into our brains quite as much when a receiver is just in kind of like bad circumstances. Like Tyrone McMillan last year, if you look at his numbers, like on a per route basis, they're actually kind of similar in terms of like where they rank among all the players at that position to what like a Saquon would have done early in his career with the Giants. But we don't think about that Tyrone McMillan season last year and think, man, that was a really frustrating experience watching Tyrone McMillan play in that offense.
You're right. And like you flip it, I think one of the reasons running backs and the run game was so valued in the NFL for so long was this idea of like a 5-yard run just looks and feels so much more satisfying than like a 5-yard check down or like a 5-yard hitch or, a 5-yard basic. Just like, okay, whatever, we got 5 yards. Doesn't feel that great. A 5-yard run feels like you've accomplished something. Like it feels like it's a positive play, even though it's the exact same amount of yardage as a 5-yard pass.
I think going back to Giants, I didn't do this to you on purpose, but I was looking at the Saquon rookie numbers compared to like Malik Neighbors, right? Malik Neighbors was on an objectively bad offense as a rookie, but he was still fine. Like his numbers and what he did independently, he was able to transcend a terrible offense when it came to his individual production in a way that a player like Saquon Barkley never would be. And I think that is important to think about when you're considering taking a running back when you have a bad team compared to taking a receiver when you have a bad team.
You're completely correct. And yet then I and again, this is anecdotal and unfair, but like I do think this is the first example that comes to mind. I go back to the Chiefs. That year they took Clyde Edwards-Helaire at 32, and it was like, well, this is different because we can afford to take Clyde Edwards-Helaire. We're set at receiver. T. Higgins, by the way, I believe was the very next pick in that draft. We're set at receiver. We can afford a luxury pick. This guy's a perfect fit for offense because he's a great receiver. It did not work out with Clyde Edwards-Helaire in Kansas City. I sort of like, yes, we would love to drop every running back into a perfect situation, but this also goes back to the carry thing you brought up, which is like, if you're a wide receiver, you're going to get a couple ISO targets here and there, especially if you're a top 5 pick, but like, you're only going to get the ball if you get open. So you're going to look efficient because you're getting the ball by your ability. Ashton Jeanty was going to get the ball 15 times a game last year, regardless of whether he was any good or not, and regardless of whether he was working or not, because the Raiders did not have alternatives. It wasn't like they were only giving him the ball in positive run scripts or, positive looks. Like they just were like,
that's a good point.
We don't want Geno to die, and so we're going to give Ashton Jeanty the ball just to make Geno's life easier. We don't trust any of our offensive linemen in pass pro, so we're going to run the ball. Outside of the one game where Pete Carroll decided to throw the ball like 50 times, and no one really seemed to understand it, including Pete Carroll. It is just like you're sort of setting up these guys in bad situations to fail, and it's through no fault of their own. And I think that makes it tough because I think we're more likely to hang on to the guys who are in incredible situations, going back to all those Shanahan era backs and being like, well, they don't count because, they were with a genius offensive coordinator and a run game that succeeds, and, teams are terrified of the play action game. Like, that's just as valid of a beneficial situation as the Jeanty or Barkley situations are as awful situations. Like, I think you can't really evaluate either of those sets of guys based on those scenarios.
Let's get to the opportunity cost argument, because I do think it's a really important one. And I also think the opportunity cost thing, to me, kind of plays into this idea of sequencing. Like, when should you draft a running back? And if you're in the top 5 and your offensive line isn't where it needs to be, or you need a pass rusher, is that another argument against drafting one? Like, is there actually a sequence in terms of how this should happen? So how do you feel about when it should come as part of the overall team building process? And where are you at with the idea of the opportunity cost of drafting a running back in the top 5 versus another position, and why it's important? Or whether it's overstated how important it is?
No, we talked about it a little bit earlier about like the financial reasons why there's an opportunity cost. I think the tough part is it isn't really about running back to me. It's about the other positions when
Agreed.
It comes to the opportunity cost. It's not we can't take this running back because he's good. It's that you only have so many shots and so many chances to actually fill the positions you cannot get in free agency. And I think what reinforces this is 2 really good running backs. I go to the Bijan Robinson situation and the Jahmyr Gibbs situation. So the Falcons draft Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson in a 3-year span. 2 players who are good players. Kyle Pitts is good now, remember, at positions we don't value as premium spots. And their pass rush was a mess for years. They tried to sign Dante Fowler. That didn't work. They draft a couple guys. That doesn't work. They make the big trade up last year. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen with James Pierce. It's unrealistic to judge him based on that. But that was we kept not addressing edge rusher. It held our team back. Even when we got the running back right, we were still in trouble until we completely had to sell out and use a ton of capital to get a guy we felt good about at the end of the first round. For the Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs rules. He is awesome. He is fun to watch. He's a great player. They draft Jack Campbell in that draft. They draft Brian Branch, Sam Laporta, all good football players, guys who they're going to sign, I think, to second contracts. They're all really useful players at positions we don't typically see as valuable. And the Lions are sitting here now, a couple years later. They don't have a right tackle because they moved Penesi with a left tackle. They don't have a second edge. They haven't had a second edge for the entirety of the Aiden Hutchinson era. I don't know if it makes a difference for them the year they lose to the Commanders because that team was just so banged up, but do they beat the Niners if they have a second edge rusher and the Niners are spending that entire second half playing from behind? They have a great defensive tackle who can pass rush. Like, I think that's the tough part is you can get those picks right and then running backs who are superstars and you feel great about. And because you only have so many shots at landing tackles, edge rushers, wide receiver. And the Lions did land a wide receiver in the middle rounds of the draft. But if you don't land that stuff, then it's going to be so hard to fill that in. And we've seen the Falcons and Lions both try to fill it in elsewhere in spots where your chances of succeeding are very low, and they haven't been able to do so.
If you look back at the 2 drafts you're talking about, and we can make an argument about the second one and even the first one, but the Falcons in 2021 drafted Kyle Pitts. Micah Parsons was the top 12 pick in that draft.
Whew.
Like it's exactly right. Like even if Kyle Pitts is a good player, they had to scramble and trade back into the first round for James Pierce because they never figured out the edge rushing thing because they spent 2 first-round picks on non-premium positions. In the Bijan draft, the next pick was, I believe, or 2 picks later, was Jalen Carter.
Okay.
And you can make it. I think Bijan Robinson is a better player than Jalen Carter is in terms of like on-field impact. I think I do believe that. But at the same time, it's harder to find a player like Jalen Carter. The Bengals just had to trade the 10th overall pick in the draft for Dexter Lawrence because you can't find interior defensive linemen of impact in free agency anymore.
Yeah, or you can, but they cost $26 million a year if you're the Eagles' like swing defensive tackle.
Yeah, it's exactly right. For a part-time player, you have to be the second highest paid player at the position in free agency, and that's happened like once in the last 5 years.
And to your point, like I think Jalen Carter is the better player of the two of them. I don't think it's like obvious. Like Jalen Carter is not, a significantly better player than Bijan Robinson.
When you wait last year, I don't think you can say that. I think if you look at their careers in totality, I think Bijan was a significantly better player last year specifically. And then when you combine that into the aggregate of his career, I think Bijan's a better player.
Yeah, I think Bijan rules. He fumbled a lot. He was terrible in pass pro. I think Bijan was better last year. I also saw Jalen Carter like take over a playoff game and pretty much get the Eagles to the next round. That's going to weigh a lot for me if I'm put it this way. Neither team does this, but if the Falcons call the Eagles and say we want to trade you, Bijan Robinson for Jalen Carter, Howie Roseman hangs up the phone, and the opposite does not happen.
That's about the availability of those players. It's not about the on-field impact of those players. I think that plays into the price.
But the NFL is pricing in. You would assume the on-field impact of those players, and I think.
But that's not the conversation we're having. It's not. Is it harder to find Jalen Carter than it is Bijan Robinson? It's who's a better player when they're on the field.
But that is the conversation. That does matter. That's why you take a guy is because the ability to get
that
guy
value,
elsewhere.
Not impact. Those are 2 different conversations. That's a value conversation, not an impact conversation.
I think what the NFL is saying is that the defensive tackles impact the game more than running backs do, and a good running back does. You can say that's wrong.
I don't think that's necessarily true. Do you think that's true though? In a vacuum, like, do you think an impact defensive tackle impacts the game more than a running back? Because that plays into the discussion that we're having.
I do think that. It is not, like there are moments where a running back can take over a game, and we're going to talk about, I think, how running backs to me mean more, maybe, than they do in terms of taking over games and having special plays than do before. But yes, I do think I have seen defensive tackles take over big games more in big moments than running backs have over the last few years. Thinking about Chris Jones and Jalen Carter specifically.
You think Jalen Carter took over games more than Saquon did for the 2024 Eagles?
During the regular season, probably not. In the postseason?
In the Rams game?
In the Rams game, yes, I do. Did you go watch the final few plays of that Rams game?
I think it's closer than you're making it out to be. I think I think the trade value plays again more into the idea of value that does to impact. And I think, again, that's something I have softened on. If you had asked me this question a year ago, like the on-field impact of these positions, which is higher, I go to the defensive lineman every single time. I think I'm starting to believe the fact that that a running back in the modern game can do it, can get to that level where like be in the similar sort of range.
Do you think the NFL is wrong then in saying, because like the pricing of those 2 positions suggests that running backs are not as impactful as defensive tackles on the whole. Like the top 6 running backs are not as impactful as the top 6 defensive tackles, and so those defensive tackles are getting paid an average of about $28 million a year, and the top 6 running backs are getting paid an average of if even that much. We just saw Dexter Lawrence coming off of a mediocre season, a really good player, get traded for the 10th overall pick. The third time in the last 25 years a team has traded a top 10 pick for a veteran player behind Russell Wilson and Randy Moss. There's no universe. You would be stunned tomorrow if you woke up and the Falcons had traded Bijan Robinson for a top 10 pick. It would be completely mind-blowing to you. And mind-blowing to me at the very least. Do you think that's wrong? Do you think that NFL teams are incorrect in feeling that way about the impactability of running backs, good running backs on the whole?
Now, when we fold in the opportunity cost and the scarcity, no. But I think those are the elements that really start pumping it up for me, is that in order to find those players at other positions, you have to draft them in the first round. You still just don't have to do that with running backs.
But with
you
can
find
value,
them in the second round.
I'm not arguing the value of running back A versus running back B. I'm arguing the whole group of running backs. Like I'm saying, are running backs on the whole, the top 10 running backs, all of them undervalued versus the ability to impact players with defensive tackle?
No, I think it's about the running backs at the top. If you ask me, would I rather have the 10th most impactful defensive tackle or the 10th most impactful running back, I would have to look at the lists next to each other. I would strongly assume it's going to be the 10th best defensive tackle. Strongly. I think this is more this argument is more limited to a very small segment of running backs at the very top. And I think the argument to bring it around to this is that people think Jeremiyah Love can be that sort of player, and that's playing into where he's being considered. The last thing about the opportunity cost part of this to me, I was just playing it out practically and just thinking about two different scenarios, right? So if you're the Titans or the Cardinals and you draft Jeremiyah Love at number 4, you've given yourself just one fewer opportunity to find a player at a position that you typically find 4th overall. Like, it's a pass rusher if you're the Titans, it's an offensive tackle if you're the Cardinals. So now you go into the 2027 draft, and in the 2027 draft, it is much, much, much more likely that you will be able to find an impact running back in the second round and versus being able to find your offensive tackle in the second round of this year's draft. Like, that's just how it often goes. And so thinking about it that way and just where you have to find these guys, like, that is almost the most important single argument in this for me, is that you just cannot find so many of these other positions in any other place than the first round, and with truly elite guys, some like in the first half of the first round. And that's why it's really hard to make the argument for the running back, even in a draft like this.
That's what makes the Chiefs conversation, when there was conversation about them taking Jeremiyah Love, so difficult for me. Is just, this is going to be their last top 10 pick for a while. You would assume. I would be shocked if they don't top 10 pick over the next 5 years. And so it's like, this is your window to get a tackle or an edge rusher. Yes, you can find a George Karlaftis at the end of the first round. Yes, you can draft Josh Simmons coming off of a serious injury and hope he turns out to be your starting left tackle. And I think he's going to be in the long run. But like, to have a guy you feel really good about, who has a really good chance of succeeding, that's a top 10 pick. And I think that's the risk of, if we take Jeremiyah Love here, again, even if he is a great player, and I hope he is, and I think he will be, the risk of missing out and not having a path to get into other positions, like you're saying. The
last thing I want to say about this is it's this idea of, well, you have a whole rookie contract to build up the rest of the infrastructure around the running back, but by taking the running back, you've robbed yourself of the ability to properly build up the rest of that infrastructure. And that's why, to me, it becomes a problem. It's not that you don't have to sequence it in that exact order. You just have so few opportunities to add a top 10 player at that sort of position to your roster that it's harder to find those guys later on if you've used one of those opportunities on a running back. So that, to me, is where the sequencing thing comes into play.
Are you okay saying we can build by going offensive line and running backs, wide receivers, and then taking the quarterback when we feel good about it? Or like, is that a viable strategy for you? Or do you think you have to go like offensive line, quarterback, and then get the other stuff?
I think that's a valid way of doing it, the first way that you talked about it. I do.
Because if you do feel that way, like,
because there are fewer quarterbacks available.
Sure.
Right? Like, I don't think you should draft a quarterback in the first round. Like, there are years where you should do it, right? Like, the Giants should have drafted Josh Allen when they drafted Saquon Barkley, but there aren't that many drafts where there are 5 quarterbacks available in the top 10.
Just thought about how my life would be different if the Giants had drafted Josh Allen in the first round. I think the emotional swing of how much I would have hated the pick versus how 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 happy I would have been to be wrong about Josh Allen. I don't know that emotionally I could have handled that swing. So maybe it was for the best the Giants did not take Josh Allen.
Let's talk about the structural changes to the league and how that has impacted this discussion, or how that should be impacting this discussion. Because again, when we were in this place where running backs didn't matter 7, 8, 10 years ago, the running game was just not as central to the way the NFL game was being played as is right now. I was looking up some of the numbers this morning. In 2018, 4 of the top 10 teams in EPA per play ran the ball less than 40% of the time. In 2018, 40% of the top 10 teams in EPA per play. In 2025, that number was 0. No teams in the top 10 in EPA per play ran the ball less than 40% of the time. Only 3 teams were below 43% in the top 10. And there were 6 of those teams in 2018. So it's just much, much harder to be a very good NFL offense in 2025 if you don't have a strong running game than it was a decade ago. Should that affect how we view the value of running backs overall?
Yes. Of course, I think it is. And I will say, and we're going to get to this as well, like, NFL defenses are aware of what was happening 7, 8 years ago, and they're playing defense differently. Like, I don't have the light box rates. I don't have the nickel rates.
They don't go back 10 years ago. Yeah.
But you get the idea. Like, I would bet no team in NFL history has played their sub packages 93, 94% of the time the way the Seahawks did last year. I'm guessing that is an NFL record, even though we don't have the data on it. And that's a product of playing from ahead, which they were for a good chunk of the year. That's a product of having great players and unique players like a Nick Wari we talked about before the Super Bowl and the difference that made. But it's also a product of teams have changed the way they play defense. I mean, I go back to really almost a decade now, but 6, 7 years ago now, how teams changed the boot game, right? Like where you had that backside edge rusher who, when teams were running outside zone, the Shanahan offense, they were chasing down or trying to chase down that play from behind and take away the cutback lane, and that opened up the play action game. And I would say probably right around 2018, we saw teams shift that edge rusher's responsibilities. Instead of chasing down outside zone from behind, they just said, it. You have to go get the quarterback. We don't care if we give up 5 yards of carry to outside zone. We don't want to give up 15 on the boot game. And so we saw NFL offenses have their play action ability impact. And now good coaches have come up with solutions. I've been watching Rams tape all week, and there's like 18 different ways Sean McVay got guys to the flat open for completions on their play action game last year. But that we've seen NFL defenses basically say, we want you to run. We've seen Fangio defenses proliferate around the NFL. We've seen defenses who want to play like Carolina, which was another Fangio-style defense with 2 deep safeties all the time. We want to see teams are basically saying, we want you to run the football. And so I don't know if that makes it easier for running backs. I just think it changes the kind of running back you want. Like, to me, I think there has to be a much higher importance placed on, can you create explosives? Can you win at second level? Do you have the vision on duo to find an open lane, even if it's at the backside of the play, and create a big play? Whereas I think with the Shanahan style offenses, it was, can you consistently be a one cut back? Can you consistently find the timing and the vision to make that cut? Teams still run plenty of zones, and that's still valuable. Jeremiyah Love, I think, is best as a zone back, and I think he's going to be running plenty of that at the NFL level. But the things we ask of NFL running backs in the run game are different now than they were 10 years ago. And so I think that changes the kind of back you want. And I think it makes certain kinds of backs more valuable than they would have been a decade ago.
The explosiveness thing is, to me, is exactly what it's rooted in, for 2 reasons. Actually, for more than that. This idea of because of the way the defenses are playing, the running game is more important. The running game is about more than the running back. And so you can make a very solid argument that, yes, you should be building up your run game infrastructure and valuing that more than you have in years past, but that can manifest with how much you're spending on a guard or where you're drafting those sorts of players. I think the Cowboys are a very good example of this. The Cowboys had 3 running backs last year, but what they've invested in their offensive line, they're still one of the most efficient running games in the league. Like, that is a viable path here. The explosion thing changes that, because we have years and years and years of data that the running backs are responsible for what happens with explosive plays. The line is more responsible for what happens in the first 5 yards of a play. And so if explosives are what's going to be at a premium here, the running backs are what create those explosives, and the guys who can become really valuable. And I was looking at it. You look at just explosive plays overall, and how many running backs are really contributing to a bunch of those explosive plays. Last year, Derrick Henry and Bijan were tied for 8th in the amount of 20-plus yard plays that they created last year. Tied for 8th. Gibbs and Achane were 11th. In 2018, you had 1 running back in the top 20. It was just Christian McCaffrey. He was the only one. And so I think you can make a really solid argument that running backs, because of what they're paid, are actually the most efficient way to pay for explosive plays in 2025. Like, if you look at Saquon and Derrick Henry 2 years ago, and if you look at the dollar amount being paid to those players and the amount of explosive plays coming from those guys, it was probably the best bang for your buck you could possibly have at any spot in the entire league. And so I do think that's a real argument for why running backs are significantly more valuable than they used to be, because explosive passes are so much harder to come by.
And I think, again, like, I think it's more you're evolving what matters as much. Like, I think, so success rate for design runs on running backs has gone up from 38% to 42% over the last decade.
It's crazy.
2015, 38%, 2025, 42%. That's a big difference. It doesn't sound like that big of a difference. It really is. And
you feel that when you watch a game. That is a big difference.
It's a big difference, and I don't think a lot of that is running backs. And I'm not saying that to disparage running backs. I think a lot of it is more the defense's choices than the offense's choices, and that they are more comfortable letting you get a successful play as long as it's not an explosive play. And I do think that changes what you look for. I think having a running back who can be consistently successful is not as valuable as it would have been a decade ago. I think about someone like, who do I want to pick on? Like a Justin Forsett, maybe. Like, Justin Forsett was a good player, an efficient back, had a good success rate his year as a starter, I think in Baltimore, right? Was that?
Yeah, it was Baltimore.
I don't recall him creating a ton of explosives. I don't think that was his game. You flip it for someone like a Kenneth Walker, where the success rate has consistently been below average, but we saw him flip the Super Bowl with his explosives. And that was a game where nobody was doing anything on offense for most of that game, except until Kenneth Walker hit a few 20, 30-yard plays, and that led to field goals. That ability, that ability to create at the second level, create at the third level, that is, I think, the thing that is undervalued. And I go back to James Cook. Like, James Cook destroys a lot of value with his fumbles, but his ability to run away from guys at the second and third level, his ability to break tackles, his ability to find open spaces is incredibly valuable. And it's something the Bills' offense does not have anywhere else with any of their other players. Maybe Khalil Shakir here and there, but like, that's the explosive play from that offense, is Josh Allen running and James Cook running. And I do think that is undervalued versus how we viewed it a decade ago. And I do think teams should be paying a premium for it, which is why I was not really upset with the Chiefs paying so much for Kenneth Walker, because of that ability to create explosives, which, by the way, Chiefs, I think, over the last couple of years are last in the NFL in explosive run rate from their running backs. So that is, I think, a big thing that was missing from that offense. So we sort of have been spending the last 2 years wondering, why is the Chiefs offense consistently struggling?
I think that, to me, is the other part of this. I think if you're going to spend high on a running back, whether that's in free agency, whether that's in the draft, it's maybe 2 different things. If you're going to spend a premium on a running back, which Kenneth Walker was a premium, he needs to be explosive. If you're going to draft one in the first half of the first round, he needs to be explosive and a positive add to your passing game. Like, both of those things need to be true. If both of those things are true, and especially in a draft like this, I think we get closer to a place where you have to jump through fewer hoops in order to justify drafting a player like Jeremiyah Love in the top 10 or the top 5.
I think yes, but I think it really depends on the availability. And I keep coming back to this idea of we're missing what actually matters here. I think when it comes to availability of alternative options, it's not day 3 of the draft. It's not undrafted free agents. It's free agents. It's veterans. It's guys.
It's second round picks and free agents. It's those two pools of guys. Those two pools give you a lot of viable players at the position. That's real.
That I think is the difference that people are missing here, and it's not the paying thing, because the money has gone down to the point where I think it's probably a pretty good value. I think guys should get paid more. I think running backs on the whole are underpaid, but it's the opportunity cost of we can't get that other guy at that premium position that we are not going to be able to fill otherwise. I don't think Jeremiyah Love is not one of the top 5 players in this draft. I don't think he has the ability. I think he has the ability to be one of the 5 most explosive players in this draft. But I just feel like it's so much harder to find players in other positions that I still feel like I come back to those same concerns about guys in the top 5 of the draft.
I typically do too. And the opportunity cost part of this, again, to me is very real. And I just think that where you're finding impact players at these positions, it's almost every single spot. It is just much more consistently happening in the top half of the first round, of the first round overall, than it is at running back. So I'm with you on that. I just think that we've gone a little bit too far the other way. And I think that there are plenty of arguments as to why drafting a running back in the first half of the first round is a better proposition now than we made it out to be 7 or 8 years ago. The last thing I'll say about this, and I had a really good conversation with an executive last week just about this idea and just kicking around all of these theoretical things that we're talking about. Well, like the surplus value of this and the opportunity cost and all of this other stuff. This is about getting enough bets right to stay at the table. That's what this is about, right?
Sure.
It's about making but it mostly is even beyond job security, building the right team. It's just about assembling and acquiring as many good players as you possibly can. And I do think that there is an argument to be made, and I've talked to analytics people about this recently, that Jeremiyah Love is probably the safest player in the draft. It's not as safe as you want it to be. It's probably closer to like 60% like you're talking about rather than 90%, but it still is a little bit safer. And so the idea that you feel safer about Jeremiyah Love becoming a good player for you compared to the premium position players that you could draft at that spot, I do think that is a solid argument as to why you should take Jeremiyah Love over those other premium position players, because I think we can remove ourselves a little bit from all the theoretical shit about surplus value and opportunity cost and everything else. Okay. We shouldn't do that all the time, but we can a little bit more often than we do.
Okay, this is the nihilist in me. I don't trust their opinions. I don't. If you can show me the guy who knows for sure, like this is like a classic. I love when I read people talk about the draft and they're like, don't overthink it. Take the guy. Don't overthink it. And it's like, who's arguing to overthink it? Who's like, oh no, you should take a kicker in round 1. I think that's the appropriate level of thought on this topic. If it's that simple, teams would be doing it, and it's not that simple. Like I see your point, and I think you're making a nuanced point that I generally agree with. But I do think that our confidence level in talking about these guys as like, well, this guy is safer than that guy, I don't think we've earned the right.
And I tend to agree with you most of the time.
Maybe. I think the way you're putting it as like it's closer to 60 than 90 is probably accurate. And I think you're probably correct here. But again, it's the thing of what do you get when you win? When you get Jeremiyah Love right, you're getting a $20 million a year player on the current cap who is at a position you can find elsewhere. And when you get it right with David Bailey, you're getting a $40 million a year player at a position it's really hard to find elsewhere. And I that doesn't mean you should feel this equal level of confidence. But I think it's probably closer to equal than GMs and people who have their jobs on the line in a way that I do not make it out to be. It's very easy to be me and just throw up your hands and be like, oh, I don't know, whatever. Like, I recognize there's a real privilege in doing that. And just, it's not my problem if, Jeremiyah Love turns out to be a superstar. I'll be okay. It's easy to throw those bombs from the outside. But I just, the evidence says we stink at this. And I think that's the part where if you have no faith in your ability to actually find the guy, take the biggest swing possible. Get the position that you can't fill elsewhere. Because I really do think you can evaluate running backs really well at this point once they're in the league. I think once you get to free agency, you can evaluate guys at a much higher level.
Do you think that's dismissing the process a little bit too much, though? Because
Probably.
I go to that same argument. I said exactly what you just said like 3 weeks ago on this show. And again, I'm trying to like push back against it. And that's why we're having this discussion.
No, for sure.
The idea that none of this matters, so just draft the premium positions every single time. I think that's I've gone to that too often too. I think that's a little bit too dismissive of the fact that there is a real process that goes into this.
I to be clear, this is not just fire all your scouts and your executives.
That's what you're saying.
Hire a 12-year-old, give them Field Yates' or Dane Brugler's big board, and just draft off that. There is a process to this, and I do think that all that process it matters and is meaningful. What I am saying is that the variance in a single year or a single 3-year period of that process swamps any confidence I have in the ability to pick guys. When you're talking about teams where the OCs are changing every couple of years, where the coaching staff is changing, where the GMs who drafted the guys are disappearing, like the noise swamps the signal so significantly. Where if I could actually get a look at Ashton Jeanty on 32 teams, I feel really confident saying, like, yeah, on the Broncos, for example, I think Ashton Jeanty would have been like an offensive rookie of the year candidate with the Broncos last year. I think he's that good of a player. The Broncos were that good of an offense. They had the infrastructure for him to succeed. They would have been playing from ahead. They would have had a great coach who can get the most out of him. But he wasn't on the Broncos. Like, we don't get to see these guys on 32 teams. And so it's so hard to evaluate. Like,
with other positions, you might not need to. And that plays into
maybe this. Maybe not. That's true. That's a very good point. But like, how do we know that? How can we feel confident that even if we do get to see a guy play well and we're like, oh, that guy's a hit or that guy's a bust, I don't feel confident that we can even get the data to have the answer to that question, let alone have meaningful differences. That's what makes this such a tough thing to judge. So that's why I feel like it is harder to gauge, not because the process is useless, just because the outcomes are so difficult to parse, and the distinction between what the process delivers and what the outcome delivers is it's so hard to draw a clear line between those two things.
The idea that we're better at identifying running back prospects in the first half of the first round, that is anecdotally true over the last 10 years. That's a sample size of like 7 dudes. Like, it just hasn't happened often enough to feel great about it. But I know people who are extremely analytically inclined in the NFL who have come to adopt that mindset, where it's like, I'm fine taking a running back in the top 10 because if you look at the impact guys, they're coming from the top 10. We actually have gotten much better at identifying those players. But that sentiment is based on very little when you think about like the history of the league. Very little.
But you know what? If you're an NFL GM, you might get 7 top 100 picks before you get fired. Like, that might be it for you. Like this is not a league where you get 8-9 years to draft. And that makes it also tougher to evaluate these GMs, right? I mean, I go back to John Schneider, who has been around for a long time, and going back to the Jamal Adams trade, Seahawks fans being like, we don't need those first round picks. He's gonna them up anyway.
Didn't you hear though that all the bad things the Seahawks did were because of Pete Carroll?
Well, you go back further, all the good things the Seahawks did were because of Scott McCloughan. So you have to go, that cycle of life changes where it's never John Schneider, good or bad, apparently. When I think he probably was the guy doing most of those things and was pretty darn good at it the entire time. I go back to Howie. I mean, Howie being a great example of like, give me a 3-year window of Howie. You might get incredible draft picks. You might get him getting yelled at. You might get Jalen Reagor. You might get Andre Dillard. And like, it's the same dude. That's what makes this so tough, is that the process of evaluating would this guy have been a great pick everywhere? Like you might find guys where they would have bust everywhere. They would have been great picks everywhere. It is so hard to gauge this stuff. And so I think that makes it so hard to actually judge the process because the outcomes are so muddled.
So if the Titans take Jeremiyah Love in the top 5, what's your reaction going to be?
I do think of these teams who could take a running back in the top 5 in a typical year, Tennessee is better suited for a running back than most of them. They've invested a ton in their offensive line. I don't know if a lot of those guys are good, but Peter Skoronski's good. That's one. They have a quarterback who I believe in Cam Ward. I think he needs help. It's not their most pressing need. I would say in the long term, it's probably not the right thing for them. I think they need edge more than they need running back, but I would rather they take a running back than Arizona.
Yeah, Arizona to me is crazy. Like it's crazy to me.
To me, the actual place I want Jeremiyah Love to go is Washington.
I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Offensive line's already there. You have offensive infrastructure. You have a quarterback who needs help. He's going to help you in terms of changing the numbers in the box in the quarterback run game. You want to work from under center. I do think that's the spot that feels best to me for Jeremiyah Love.
I think overall, my stance on this is that I've softened on it. When you consider all of the variables in every single category, I do think that, and really sitting with them, my stance has been a little bit too hardline when it comes to when you can do this and when it's when it's okay and why it's okay. Because I do think enough stuff has changed, and I do think we over-index too many of these variables when we're talking about taking a running back and what it really means and what it prevents you from doing.
I feel better. I feel like top running backs are underpaid. I feel like
yes,
paying running backs I'm much more inclined to do than I would have been a decade ago. Drafting running backs in the top 10, I'm a little nervous about, although I do think, like you said, there is a sample of some positives here and there. I'm not as on board with that as you are. But I do think the idea that, like, again, James Cook should be making $16, $17 million a year, and he's making 11.5. That doesn't seem fair.
I think that's the right place to land. I will say, I still have I would have a lot of hesitance about it because of the opportunity cost stuff. That's what it gets to for me. It's not even the money anymore. Like, the money is not the most important factor. And when we were talking about this recently, I think I went to the money first. I think I went to the 40 million versus 15 million. I think that was the first thing I said. And I think this is more to me about where you can find these players. It's a scarcity argument over a surplus value argument. To me, is the most compelling point among all of these. And I don't think I've gone to that place often enough in having this discussion.
I agree. So just get Kenny Gainwell, and you're fine.
As long as you have a really good offensive line.
As long as you have a quarterback who wants to throw swing screens like 30% of the time, you're going to have a really good receiving back.
I'm glad we brought this about around to Aaron Rodgers. That's exactly where I wanted to end this discussion. Bill Barnwell, thank you very much for the time, sir. I know it's a busy week. We all got a lot going on. Tell people where they can read all of your wonderful musings about the National Football League.
ESPN.com. Last thing I wrote when you guys listen to this would probably be about the Dexter Lawrence trade, which, yeah, I don't know. I'm intrigued. I mean, like I said, third time in the last 25 years a team has traded a top 10 pick for a player. I like Dexter Lawrence. I don't know if he was worth a top 10 pick.
I'm generally okay with it.
Yeah, that's fair.
I'm generally okay with it. Like, their window and like where you have to find these guys. And again, this gets back to me with like, I said this immediately. I broke down for like 2 minutes on our show because it happened over the weekend. But I get back to a place where you just can't find players like this in free agency. They just don't exist. And the idea of trading a top 10 pick for one, that seems like a ton. But Quinnen Williams went for way more than a top 10 pick, first of all, when you combine the value of those two picks. And the Bengals have tons of money to spend. You're never going to be able to spend all of your free agent money on worthwhile players anymore. It's just not going to happen based on where the cap is. So you're going to have to trade draft capital for it. This is a weak draft. And if you look at the way the draft could play out, For a team like the Giants, who could justify drafting an offensive lineman, who probably need an offensive lineman, who need a receiver, there's so many different directions you could go with the 10th overall pick. For the Bengals, they need a defensive player. It is not hard to picture a scenario where Styles, Love, all the pass rushers are gone by the time they pick a 10, and they're sitting there being like, we'd rather have Dexter Lawrence. I understand landing in that place, even if it's a real premium.
I would have waited until draft day maybe to make that trade then.
That's fair. That's fair.
Or I would have traded up, or maybe I would have signed Trey Hendrickson and held on to the 10th overall pick and just not giving up 10th overall pick to get the good defensive player. But I mean, your arguments are not invalid. I just like draft picks, as it turns out, maybe too much.
I think some of us like draft picks too much, and that brings it all back around. All right, Barnwell, thank you very much for the time, my friend. We'll talk to you very soon.
Thanks, buddy.
All right, guys, that's all we got for today. We will be here tomorrow night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Me, Dane Brugler, Dave Hellman, Derek Klassen, Bruce Feldman, live on the Athletic Football Show YouTube page, breaking down every pick of the first round, and then we will be back, except for Bruce. The other four of us will be back on Friday doing the exact same thing, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, with rounds 2 and 3. Two of my favorite nights of the year. Very much looking forward to it. Please come and join us. We would really appreciate it. For now, that's all we got. Appreciate you listening. We'll talk to you very soon. Thanks for watching. Follow the Athletic Football Show wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube.